Good afternoon. This is the House Appropriations Committee. It is Tuesday. No, it's not Tuesday. It's Thursday, January 8th, 2026. It is about 1:15 p.m. and we're delighted to have Chris Roop here from the Joint Fiscal Office to talk to us about pensions and OPEB and an update because things are happening and Chris is our expert. And we have somebody from the Treasurer's office here as well.
Sure.
Phone a friend as needed.
Absolutely. Good afternoon, everybody. Chris Roop from the Joint Fiscal Office. It's nice to see everyone. Madam Chair, as you mentioned, I'm delighted to be joined by my colleague, Tim Duggan from the Retirement Office, who can jump in with any additional, any answers or add any color to whatever responses I come up with, whatever you decide to ask me today. But I think one of the reasons why the chair asked me to come in today was just to give you all a little bit of background on what's happened in the last fiscal year with the state employee and state teacher retirement systems. One of the fun things I realized last night when I was finishing my slides was that this might be the only committee in the building where everybody sitting here was here in 2022. Like some of you might have taken a break, but I think all of you were here on some committee in 2022 when Act 114 passed.
Which is when we took on pension.
Right.
Yeah, I remember Act 114.
Yeah, it's the pension bill, yeah. How could you forget, Representative Stevens? It took like an entire year, and it was also.
That was in the Fish and Wildlife, wasn't it?
Yeah, exactly. And it was also an interesting bill to work on because, I think it was the only bill that passed twice unanimously by everybody who voted for it. So I think what I'll show you will give you all a sense that the bill you passed is working. It's showing positive signs. There's still a long way to go to get to where we need to be, but try to keep your foot on the gas to the best you can and stay focused on trying to adhere to the funding policies that you all put in place. Before I go through my slide decks, which are pretty short, I just want to show you something that sort of contextualizes why we're talking about this. This is the Capital Debt Affordability Advisory Committee report from this past year. And if you take a look at this graphic from page 40 of 123, this compares long-term debt obligations across the states using S&P from all 50 states using S&P's methodology. They standardize things to sort of have an apples to apples comparison of different states. And there's other graphics in here from other rating agencies that slice and dice this data in different ways, but they all show the same thing, that Vermont is on the high end when it comes to our long-term obligations. And when you look at the color components in that column, it would help if I scroll up. The red column at the top there represents OPEB, and the blue represents pension. And the green one, that little one at the bottom, represents your long-term debt, your bonds and things like that. So the reason why I'm showing this to you is that our retirement obligations are a very significant component of our state's long-term liabilities. And it really crowds out the state's ability to issue debt for other purposes, quite frankly. So no matter how you chop this up, whether you're looking at it as percentage of personal income or available revenues, we're at the high end of states in terms of and what's driving a lot of it is our long-term retirement liabilities. It's not our long-term bonded debt. So I just wanted to sort of frame this by showing you that, because this is why this conversation is important.
Well, that green is our bonds.
Yeah, that's your bonds and your other, the sort of non-retirement.
What the number is, us, Vermont?
Yeah, that's us.
6.6.
That's us.
And so the mean is 6%, and we're at 12.6. So we're twice the average.
Yeah,
average isn't the same as median. We're worse with the median.
Right, well, we're less than all those other guys.
No, we're.
So hold on that side.
I know.
We're not Illinois, we're not Connecticut. We're not Nebraska either.
Right, our OPEB is a negative.
That's not us. The line that's below, that's Alabama, I think you're looking at.
That's really impacting.
We are the, seventh or eighth one? We're the one with the 12.6 above it.
Oh, the 12.6, okay.
Yeah.
So the OPEB is above the pension.
So the bottom line is that it's really impacting our ability to have that bonding capacity.
Well,
That's right.
bonding capacity and
He's looking for-
general fund.
I don't think any of it is.
Do general fund anywhere else?
Yeah, and that's on the treasurer's website, and it's also, if you look for CDAC, CDAAC, you can pull that report right up. It's a really wonderful report that they issue every year. But anyway, I wanted to offer that to you all just to give you a sense of why this is important and something that you need to pay attention to. And I'm also, in the theme of looking around this room and realizing you all have been here in 2022, this is not a 101 level presentation. I am assuming you have a foundational level understanding of what a pension is. If I am making a false assumption at any point, please raise your hand and interrupt me, because there are no stupid questions when it comes to this. And if I'm not making sense to you, I'm probably not making sense to other people. So I'm trying to figure out what the right level is here without getting too bogged down in the weeds. So I'm going to start with pensions. And again, I'm really just focusing on the two state systems that are funded out of the state budget. I'm not looking at VMERS, the muni system, which is funded by the municipal governments. Just looking at VSERS and VSTERS. And if those acronyms get confusing, the way I keep them straight is the T for teachers, distinguishes that one. Our amortization period is a closed 30-year period. So I like to look at data that's happening within that 30-year period, because a lot of what happened before then is sort of historic at this point. And these are just sort of the standard disclaimers that if you all want more information, almost all of this stuff, unless it's otherwise indicated, comes from the actuarial valuations. I emailed them to the committee a few minutes ago. You don't need to look at them now, but if you want to know like how many members are in group C, like that's what's in there. I'm happy to dive in. I love reading these things. It's like Christmas morning when they land in the
We're so
fall,
grateful you do.
but don't read them now. So I just wanted to refresh you before we go into the numbers about a few key points. You're going to hear me talk about the ADAC a lot, the actuarially determined employer contribution. You all as appropriators, the ADAC is really what you think about, because that is the funding requirement that you have presented to you by the retirement boards every year that you then fund through the budget. And the ADAC has two components. It's the normal cost and the admin expenses. So the normal cost is what you need to put into the system every year to fund the benefits that current employees are earning as they work every year.
So it's like the current cost.
Exactly. Every time we're working, every year the system is shedding some liability by paying benefits to retirees, and it's also incurring liability by owing a benefit to today's employees when they retire in the future. So the normal cost is what you need to pay to sort of just keep chugging along and make sure your future benefits are going to be funded over the course of your working life. The other piece is the amortization payment on the unfunded liability. The unfunded liability is a debt that needs to be made whole over time. We amortize that with interest over a funding schedule. It runs through 2038, and payments are scheduled to increase by 3% annually in future years. And the thinking behind that is that the cost would roughly grow with active payroll and represent sort of a constant percentage of payroll over time. So what's really important about that is when you see, oh, the ADAC went up by X million over last year, that is not a very helpful thing to think about, because you're expecting it to go up every year based on our funding system. What you really need to look at is how is it growing in relation to the active payroll? If it's growing a lot faster as a share of payroll, that means your costs are really going up. So viewing things not just in dollar terms, but looking at the rate of growth and what does it mean as a percentage of active payroll helps control for all of that. When active employees, I should have mentioned this, active employees, whenever we're working, we make contributions into the system. That goes toward the normal cost. It doesn't go to the unfunded liability. It doesn't fully fund the normal cost. So the employer, in most cases being state government, funds the rest of the normal cost plus those unfunded liability costs through the ADAC. Something really important that I wanted to remind you all, and this is going to come up when you see the big bill, is that part of Act 114 committed the state to making additional payments above the ADAC, and we call those colloquially the plus payments. Those began in FY '24 at 9 million per system, so 18 total. Then they went to 12 million per system in FY '25. Then in the current year in '26, they went up to 15 million per system. They're going to stay at 15 million per system until each system hits 90% funded. So that's expected to be in 2033 for VSERS, 2 years later for the teachers. It sounds really far away. It's not. You're looking at the '27 budget.
Talking 12 years.
Exactly. It's
Or
gonna,
11 if you do the FY '27 budget.
it's all going to be here before we know it. The plus payments come out of the general fund. You appropriate them in a discrete section. And the benefit of that is mathematically, it's kind of similar to making an extra mortgage payment where you are accelerating the pay down of the principal and you're saving interest costs in the big picture. And you're lowering the growth rate on future ADACs. So the way I think about it is like, if you pay more now, you're buying yourself some budget capacity in the future. And mathematically, the way this works, everything's on a 2-year lag. So any extra money you put in like FY '26 would lower the ADACs beginning in FY '28 moving forward. So the benefits of the plus payments are immediately recognized in the math, but on a 2-year lag. It's not like your mortgage at home where if you like prepay it, you might just be done a month sooner or whatever. Here, you actually immediately recognize the benefit and having the payments go down a little bit below them what they otherwise would. I see there's a question.
Go ahead.
Hypothetically, if we use the $75 million that's in the that's in the BAA for a one-time payment, what would that do?
I would want the actuaries to model it based on where we are in the current system, but you actually, in the current schedule, but you actually did this very thing as part of Act 114, and you put a $75 million one-time payment in VSERS and a $125 million payment into the teacher system, 200 million total. I believe that happened in FY '22, and it started lowering the ADACs beginning in FY '24. So those ADACs, and this is like really back of the envelope, but it lowered those future payments by, I mean, millions, like in total, like tens of millions. It might have been close to like 14 million or so below what they otherwise would have been. But it does have a positive impact on your moving forward. Another caveat I want to mention, though, is that everything I'm saying here is based on all assumptions perfectly panning out in the future and everything being held status quo. You all know that that's not the way the world works. Every year there's gains and losses. Assumptions get trued up, assumptions get revised. The only way we can talk about this coherently is by sort of assuming that the assumptions you have in place are going to be met moving forward. So I can say you put 75 million in this year and you're going to save X amount in 2 years, beginning in 2 years. But if the market tanks, you might not actually see the payment go down by that much due to other factors. So some of this is relative also. Last point on this slide is like really wonky budget stuff. If you start looking through the big bill being like, where's the VSERS payment? You're not going to find it because we fund the VSERS systems through the personnel budgets of the underlying departments. So whenever you are approving a budget for a department, there's money in there for the pension benefits and the OPEB benefits of their employees. And we recover that through an assessment rate that's charged against the departments. So it works different than the teacher system, where the teacher system is directly appropriated in the B500s. And you'll see that the normal cost comes out of the ed fund and the unfunded liability comes out of the general fund. There's like a whole little discrete section there.
You fee 514 and 515.
I believe that's exactly right. Yeah.
I can't do that with everything, but I use it.
So what's happened in the last year? Every fall, the pension systems engage the actuaries to take a look back at what happened in the last fiscal year. We call this the actuarial valuation. Yeah, it happens every year. And this is really the opportunity to look back and see what was the experience that the plan had in the last fiscal year, compare that against the actuarial assumptions, quantify like what were your gains and losses, and then these valuations are used to calculate the ADAC for the year 2 fiscal years hence. So we just finished the FY '25 valuations, and that's what's used to calculate the ADACs for FY '27. There was some encouraging news on the pension front in FY '25. This is the third year in a row that investment performance exceeded the 7% assumed rate of return. And one of the things that's really interesting now, and I'll get into this in a later slide, is that we now have deferred market gains that we haven't yet recognized into the funding math. And that's going to be recognized in future years. So the funds sort of have a wind at their backs right now. And that's going to sort of help prevent or help curtail loss experience from high inflation or other things. So it's good to have deferred gains as opposed to deferred losses. Up until this year, we had some deferred losses because a few years ago, we had a really rough investment year. So we are now at the point where those deferred losses have been fully sort of recognized and rolled off. And now we've got a wind at our backs. So investments have been great. There still have been some areas of actuarial losses that we've experienced, like everybody has experienced with higher than assumed inflation. That has led to higher than assumed cost of living adjustments and salary growth. So that shows up in the pension system. For a long time, we had really low inflation and COLAs were lower than assumed. So that was actually an area of gain. But in the last few years, inflation has been higher than the assumption. So we've taken a little bit of a loss from that. What I think you're really going to care about is what's in this blue chart. What has happened with the Pension Aid Act since last year? You've seen that VSERS grew by 2.6%, the teachers by a little bit more than that. Remember, if everything were to go absolutely perfectly, we would expect these numbers to grow by like around 3% a year. So this is on like an inflation adjusted basis. And when you consider how payroll's been growing, this is pretty good. I mean, this is essentially flat. So this is what like passes for good news in the pension world is like the absence of really bad things happening that cause like hundreds of millions of dollars of losses. Like when you have a year that things pan out pretty close to where you thought they'd be, that passes for good news.
It's still a $12 million increase.
It is a tremendously expensive
Yes.
line item. I don't want to sugarcoat the fact that the state of Vermont is pumping a large amount of money into shoring up the retirement systems. That is something you all deserve a tremendous amount of credit for doing.
Yes, which we could use for other
See what you
things.
did there with the word travel.
I was looking at another one where you had year over year, 11.99% for the.
I'm going to get to that. That's less encouraging. That's the next slide deck.
My question was, what's the difference between the teachers and the state employees that causes that
It's
differential?
different.
Yeah, so you're talking about OPEB, and I'll ask you that question when we get to OPEB. When we're at pensions, the benefit structures actually have a lot of similarities between the two systems. There are some notable differences. Most teachers are in a similar benefit system, whereas the state employees do have some other groups for different professions. The underlying formula and retirement eligibility are slightly different, but not massively different. And one reason why you see the teacher system have a higher cost than the state employee system is because the state system was better funded and has a lower unfunded liability than the teacher system. So the teacher system is a bigger hole that we're digging out of.
Thanks.
So, sorry.
Do those numbers on this chart,
Yeah.
they include the plus payments?
Do include the plus payments. Yeah, so the plus payment is flat at 15 million year over year because we've fully phased in the plus payment.
Okay, thank you.
So here's where we are right now. We often talk about this term, the funded ratio, which is, take a look at what you owe, compare it against what you have on a present value basis, and convert that into a percentage. And, this is one of many data points to look at when looking at pensions. And when I look at the funded ratio, what I specifically look at is what direction is it going over time and why? So we have a pretty encouraging story to tell that since things were really at their sort of worst in 2020, steady progress has been made every year at improving the funded ratio. Right now, VSERS has the highest ratio since 2016, and the teachers at the highest ratio since 2011. And the funding policy you currently have in statute calculates the ADAC payments to get you to 100% funded by 2038. So every year, if everything works according to the way we hope the world's going to work, you'll see a couple percentage point gain, hopefully, in that ratio as we get closer and closer to 2038. Something else I wanted to point out too is that our systems are both cash flow positive right now, which means that and this is in large part due to the fact that you all are pumping so much money into the systems to get them in a better status, that the contributions going in exceed the payments going out, which means the folks running the systems can make more efficient investment decisions. That means you're not necessarily selling investments in order to make benefit payments. You can be a little more strategic, and that's a good thing.
So, Chris, we chatted about this a little bit yesterday. The closer we get to 2038, the higher the volatility and the more risk we have. It's kind of like you're going to retire in 5 years. You're counting on your investments in the stock market, and if the stock market tanks 3 years before your retirement, you don't have a lot of time to make it up.
Yeah.
And so, and maybe this is a question for you too. How are we thinking about that?
Yeah, that's a great question and a great analogy, I think. Right now we have everything amortized on a single close layer that ends in 2038. If there were to be, as we get closer to 2038, there are fewer years left in that schedule to spread out the impact of anything wacky happening. So like, if we have a really weird investment situation happening in the early 2030s, that could cause a tremendous amount of volatility in the employer contribution. Because think about those timing lags I mentioned, what happens in 2033 doesn't hit the ADAC till 2035, and then you would only have a few years to pay for it. So as you get closer to that end date, the risk factors driving the volatility in the employer contribution heighten.
Yeah.
There is a bill that has been introduced in GovOps, H567. It is going to be taken up tomorrow, I believe, that the Treasurer's Office has proposed.
Okay.
There is, I think, you will probably see some language to propose a working group that would take a look at working with the actuaries to model out some scenarios, to come up with plans on what should life after 2038 look like, and what scenarios should you all possibly employ if we do have a weird situation happen between now and 2038 to help mitigate some of that contribution risk.
Right. So is there a way we can lay off the risk somewhere?
Yeah. So like there's ways, actually the retirement systems did a risk assessment last year where they looked at this and modeled some situations. If you want to look at the visuals of those graphs, they're on the Treasurer's website, but there's many options. Some of them could be, have amortized each year's gains and losses on their own closed layer rather than sort of have everything in one layer that's all on the same time frame. That way you could still address most of sort of the legacy problem by under status quo, but then deal with anything sudden that comes up on a slightly longer extended runway. That's one of many options that can be looked at.
Mhm.
So I think that's something that the Treasurer's Office and the retirement boards and their actuaries have been thinking about. And I think you'll see some language come before you all as the session goes on to set up a process to come up with some options.
So I see Tom and Dave.
So you had said that people pay and employees pay in, but they're not paying for the accrued liability.
They go to the normal cost.
Right. So it doesn't matter from a state perspective or from this fund's perspective, whether or not if there's 1,000 vacancies in the big, if those are fully, if those are fully filled or not in terms of the paying off the accrued.
Right. There's two things at play. I think if you have a ton of vacancies or like a surprising amount of vacancies, it creates the need to make sure that finance and management's payroll rate is generating enough money to fully fund the ADAC for the year. And finance and management makes adjustments as the year goes on. Like they come up with an estimate being like, if we need to raise, X million and we think the payroll is going to be this, what percentage do we need to apply to get the money? if all of a sudden your payroll's really gone down, that rate just might need to be tweaked and money that you'd be spending on salaries for vacant positions might go toward the payroll rate instead. But in the big picture, fewer people in the system also means lower liabilities are being accrued in the system.
Which is my part two question,
Yeah.
which is in 2038, speaking personally, I'll be at some point in 2038, I'll be 77. And I'm towards the end of the baby boom, which I'll just assume anybody who's older than me will have, there's fewer baby boomers left at that point, which then the system would be paying for, this huge drop compared to now of what people are using those.
Yeah, it's really complicated because it's also like today's active employees are probably going to earn a more expensive pension benefit when they retire than today's retirees are currently drawing out of the system. Because by the time today's employees retire, they'll have a much higher ending salary and a higher benefit than people who might have retired 10 years ago and are currently in pay status. So if the number of employees stayed the same, roughly, as you went along in the system, you would expect the liabilities to still kind of increase over time. Because even though you're shedding liability as you pay benefits to retirees, you're accruing a little bit more to pay the future benefits of today's workers. So it's a little bit of a knot to untangle.
Thanks.
I've got Dave and then John.
So, back to the issue of things get complicated before 2038, and everything's changing and whatnot. Couldn't one just do a remortgage? Hey, instead of 2038, let's push it out to 2044,
One
recalibrate.
One could do that, but that would come at a higher total cost to the taxpayer over time. Because you would be paying high, it's just like sort of refinancing a home mortgage or extending a line of credit or whatever. You might trade a lower payment in the near term for higher total interest costs paid over the life of the obligation.
There's so many opportunity costs, though. If childhood poverty matters to me.
Yep.
The quality of our schools that are falling apart matter to me. The quality and stability of our hospitals matter to our taxpayers. Many of those things, because if you don't remortgage, in that case, you can't address. So while you might be looking good on one particular line item of the budget, you're falling apart on the others. And that's kind of nothing wrong with having that kind of a values conversation.
Well, I think what you're getting at is the trade-off between the short term and the long term. And there is a long-term cost associated with a short-term decision that might save money in the near term. And I would challenge all of you as legislators to think also about, you want to talk about opportunity costs, leaving the potential to pay for benefits using investment gains. You want to take advantage of that opportunity. You want to be able to invest the money and maximize Wall Street earning the money to pay for benefits as opposed to taxpayers having to pay for it. And so there's a real trade-off, and it can be, I think a lot of states have gotten themselves into some pretty problematic fiscal situations by underpaying their long-term liabilities to free up money in the short term, because it can create a problem that can take decades afterwards to get back in front of.
Yeah, appreciate
But
it.
I appreciate that question.
That's sort of what we've done to get ourselves into this hole.
I would say so I'm really trying to talk about the current amortization period. Before that started, from 1979 through 2007, the teacher ADAC was underfunded, I think in all but 4 years. And that is a big reason why the teacher retirement system is a lower funded ratio than the state system, why that orange line is below the blue line. And we have been making up for that underfunding ever since. Like, if you underfund an ADAC in 1 year, it doesn't make the obligation go away. Like, the obligation's still there. It just means all your future payments are going to be recalculated at a higher rate to pay off that shortfall. So the former treasurer, Beth Pierce, often liken this to paying cash for something or putting it on the state's credit card. If you shorten the ADEC, you might save money closing this year's budget, but that doesn't go away. Like that, it's just gonna pop back up in future years' ADECs.
Oh, wait, no, I have John first and then me.
So I'm not sure how this affects any of that, what we're talking about here, but there's a point in time people reach their eligibility to retire, whatever it might be here, right? And some folks take advantage of that and they retire, take their benefits here with them. Others decide to stay longer. Maybe just a little bit longer, perhaps just a couple of years or significantly longer if they were relatively young and started working here. So where is that?
Hold that thought.
Thinking about this, it's probably the next slide.
Yeah, it's in a couple slides, but yes. So
And the reason why I'm asking the question here is I remember in Vermont State Colleges when, the economy kind of like tanked. People were just about ready to retire, at least some
Yeah.
group were.
Right.
Perhaps even beyond the point where they had thought they were probably going to do it, but they decided to stay a little bit longer to kind of make up for what their losses were because they may have had some of the retirement stuff placed in some higher risk things. That wasn't the best thing to be doing at a particular age. You still want to really go that way, be more conservative investment kinds of things. And they stay longer. And some of them quite a bit longer. It was okay here, but the Dean of Administration would come ask me every year, so who do you know is going to retire? Because we're trying to figure out the budget stuff.
Sure.
That's all.
I'm gonna get to that in like 2 slides, but
Okay,
I'm
great.
glad you mentioned it because that it's gonna help me.
Wayne has a question.
As I recall, the Garcia decision was made in 1979. And that changed everything. I know I mapped it out for Fish and Wildlife in those days because I had to look at our revenue, of course, with special funds coming in from license sales and how do your revenue curves go with your expense curves with the increase in salary. And when that happened, because Fish and Wildlife were pretty much parallel for many years back into the 50s. So when that decision happened, there was an inflection point, and never were the revenues ever going to make up for it again. And it looks to me like the Garcia decision is the reason what impacted that whole pension thing.
I'm not familiar with the Garcia decision. I'm not a lawyer, nor do I pretend to be one, but
Well, the Garcia decision was where all of a sudden you had all the overtime issues, and the fairness in pay, things came into play. And it changed that whole trajectory at that time.
What you could count to go to your
No, I mean,
pension or your last years?
the flexibility of how much I pay you as, versus you. And it changed that whole formula. Let me look it up. I'll give you.
All right, get back
What's
to
the
us.
outline?
All right, Lynn.
Yeah, I'm gonna say that I was involved with the school board and involved with a lot of people with school boards in our area. And the thing that happened in the Dean administration is one year we decided not to go and fund the,
It was like $6,000 or $6
I don't know,
million. It was like
whatever it
$6
was.
million. It was a
It
small
was-
amount.
you not only, the stock market was going crazy, this
Right.
was, but it was, once you don't put it in, not only
That's
do
right.
you miss that money, but you miss the money that money
Right.
grows for the
Yeah.
next 30 years. That's part of the reason why the teachers are so under the liability. I think 60% is the benchmark.
things start getting really worrisome when you get below.
Yeah.
When you start getting below 60 and into the 50s, and things start getting
Yeah.
really, really
And the other
worrisome.
thing with the
1%,
teachers is that OPEB was not funded.
Right. It was
That came out of the
changed.
focus of their pension, whereas the state employees had
Right.
pension and they had OPEB, and the OPEB has grown ridiculously.
We're gonna get to that in a couple minutes.
It's a double whammy.
Yeah. So here's where we are.
So, yeah, I've got 2 pictures here to show you where we are right now. The blue bars show the liabilities. So that is what the systems owe to people for service that's been rendered. The green bar is the actuarial value of assets. So that's the money that we have on the present value or the money we have once you adjust for the smoothing of investment gains and losses. excuse me. And then the red line, the unfunded liability, is essentially the gap between those bars. That's the shortfall. So you'll see that the state employee system has an unfunded liability of just over $1 billion right now. The way our amortization is structured with the 3% growth in payments means that most of the progress on paying down that unfunded liability happens at the tail end of the amortization period. So the first half of the amortization period, you're not even really treading water. The payments then catch up to the point where you rapidly pay down the principal of that unfunded liability in the back end. So we're now at that point where we're seeing that positive amortization and we're chipping away at it.
So this is like if you have a home mortgage, for people to understand that. If you have a 20-year mortgage or whatever, you spend a whole lot of the first few years paying interest, and eventually you get to the principal, and at the end, you're pretty much all paying principal. And, people also may remember that if you make one extra principal payment a year, you can cut your payments down significantly. And so our plus payments are kind of a little.
It's excellent. Yeah. Yep. Same picture for the teachers. To see the numbers are a little bit bigger. The unfunded liability is 1.75 billion for the teacher system. But again, progress since 2020 and 2021. This has been chipped away at by over $200 million. So going to Representative Kaczynski's question, this chart shows the gains and losses that happened in the pension systems over the last year. If it's a positive value above the line, that means that thing increased the unfunded liability, which is not what we want to see. If you see a negative value below the line, that means it chipped away at the unfunded liability, and that's what we want to see. So in this picture, the negatives are positive, positives are negative. And what the valuations do is they take a look at what's happened in the system over the last year, compare that to your actuarial assumptions, and then put a price tag on the deviation. And you'll see here that that first column about the amortization, that just shows the net of the payments in being bigger than the accruing normal cost and interest. So you're chipping away at that principal. Had really strong investment gains. So we saw some positivity there. So those numbers reflect the dollar impact of the performance that we had relative to the 7% assumption. It's not relative to zero. Everything about this is about how things compare to the assumptions we have in place. Salary experience, COLA, mortality, retirements, net turnover. Representative Kaczynska, you were asking about people's retirement behavior. The actuaries have an entire set of assumptions that look at different employee groups and at what probability rates they expect people to retire at different ages and years of service.
Depending upon which department they work for too, right?
There's different, the general employees are very different than the state police. They have very different structures. Yeah. And, the state employees or a lot of them do work in Group F, a lot of them do work past the point at which you're first eligible to retire. The actuaries build in an assumption of a certain percentage of people are going to continue working. It's a little different with the state troopers because for a long time they had a mandatory retirement age at 55. It's still at 57, but the vast majority of their members retired once they were eligible at age 50 with 20 years of service. So there were not very many members that continued to work long past the point they were eligible. Part of Act 114 actually created an incentive to encourage people to retire a little bit later. And it enhanced the benefit formula a little bit for each extra year you would work beyond the point at which you were first eligible to retire. So net turnover is also sort of the other side of that coin that shows, what are the patterns of people who are leaving service for reasons other than retirement. So if, I got hired at age 30 and left at age 35 and did not leave to retire, I went to go do something else for the next 30 years. That's going to have a very different impact on the pension system than if I were hired at age 30 and I worked for 35 years and then left to retire. Other gains and losses, you see there's always miscellaneous true ups, but when you roll everything together across all of the factors, you'll see on the far right that the state employee system the unfunded liability principal was chipped away at by about 22 million and the teachers by about 36 million. They don't sound like big numbers in the big picture, but remember where we are in the amortization schedule. Like as we get closer to 2038, you're going to see that impact accelerate.
It's in the right spot being negative.
Yeah, for once, right?
You like that.
So this slide just shows investment performance. And as I mentioned, systems had exceeded the 7% rate of return for the third year in a row on a market basis. But we don't fund pensions based on the market value because the market value can be so volatile. If you look at the bars on that figure, that shows what the market value investment return is. And you can see how wildly it jumps around. If you are calculating the ADAC based on that, you would have a crazy amount of budget volatility in your contribution requirements. So the way systems try to make the budgeting less volatile and smoother and more predictable is they recognize market gains and losses over a 5-year period. And we say that it's smoothed out. And the actuarial value of assets reflects that smoothing. And that's what that line is on the chart. So just like I said, it looks much smoother than the volatile bars, but you can see that when you look in the rearview mirror, again, past performance is not a predictor of future results. Our assumption is 7% and our long-term average results are, slightly above that in many cases, depending on what time frame you look at. So our assumption and our investment performance have not been wildly out of whack.
Except for that one bad year.
Yeah, that was a bad year for everyone. Yeah,
2022.
yeah, that was a rough year. The markets were bad that year.
It was the year, maybe it was the previous year. Anyway, we should have done a lot better at one
Well,
particular.
and these are also on a fiscal year basis, not a calendar year basis. So they're very endpoint sensitive.
Yes.
So how you measure that time period can give you a very different result too. But investments over time have not been, other than the Great Recession happening, that's not really why the systems are in the situation they're in. It's other factors. A lot of it, honestly, has been the assumptions have been changed to be more realistic.
Yes, I know. We need more. It's like making the math work, even though reality isn't anything. Were we having like 8.5% returns that we
Yeah,
were assuming?
It was up there and a lot. We're not an outlier with this. Nationwide, most pension systems in the last 15 years have been gradually lowering their assumed rate of return. And we're pretty close to the median and the average at 7%. But, if you go back to, the 90s, you didn't have to take on any risk to earn 7%. You could put money in like a CD and a money market account and earn that return. So, the world has changed over the last few decades, and the ability to earn money within acceptable levels of risk and volatility has changed. So that's why a lot of systems have gotten a little more conservative in their assumption.
And this is why our, part of what we did when we redid the whole pension thing was with VPIC and changing the people who did that. And it matters so much who those people are and their experience. So we don't end up with junk bonds or.
Yeah, and you don't want to have unrealistic assumptions because that means you're not putting enough money in on the front end.
Right.
And that means, and it means that shortfall gets added to the credit in the unfunded liability. So having realistic assumptions is really important to make sure you're putting in the right amount of money at the right time.
Right. Okay, thank you.
Just like your retirement account.
Exactly.
So
Somebody else's retirement.
Yes.
I think I basically talked about all this at this point. This just talks about the fact that we now have deferred gains in the math. So we had such a strong investment year in FY25 that the deferred losses that we had been carrying have now flipped the other way. So now VSERS has a $55 million deferred gain and the teachers have an $88 million gain. And, that's encouraging moving forward. A couple bad investment years can reverse that, but generally it's optimistic when you see the market value of assets being higher than the actuarial value of assets, because that means you've got some gains that you haven't sort of taken credit for yet in your funding math. So again, what you guys really care about, the ADAC, the amount of money that comes out of the budget into the retirement systems to fund them appropriately. This shows you over time, over the course of the amortization period, for VSERS, what the ADEC has been and what has actually been contributed. So you'll see that costs have gone up steadily since the beginning of the amortization period. That really big spike in 2022 represents the one-time payments from Act 114. And then you'll see as you start moving closer to the present, that the amount of money being contributed is higher than the ADEC, and that reflects the impact of the plus payment. And when I mentioned that these costs under a blue sky are expected to increase in dollar value, it helps to control for the percentage of active payroll to like really get a sense of what's growing. I put this line in here to try to do that. And you'll see that, yes, pre-Act 114, these costs were steadily increasing as a percentage of pay. You know, the impact of that one-time payment really distorted things a bit. But in the last 3 years that we have full data for, the ADEC as a percentage of active payroll has started to stabilize a bit. So that's encouraging. That's what you would want to see. I have the same chart now for the teachers, and you'll see that the ADEC's actually going down slightly as a percentage of active payroll. But another thing I wanted to mention, just to remind anybody watching this on both of these slides, is that the actual amount contributed in has exceeded the actuarial recommendation. So the state during the amortization period we're in, I'm not talking about decades ago, but in the amortization period we're in, the state has overfunded its actuarially determined funding requirements. So it is more than adhered to its end of the bargain. So that's it for pensions. If anybody else has any questions on that, we can pivot over to OPEB.
Well, may I just,
Yes, go ahead, Dave.
we're going through hard times. We need to find money wherever we can. If we're overfunding our obligation, what bad thing would happen if we dropped what we're committing to just funding it, but not overfunding it?
So I would say that if you were, the commitment the legislature made when you all passed Act 114 was to intentionally overfund it for a period of time.
To make the
And
2038 work?
yeah, in order to accelerate the pay down until the systems are 90% funded, I would also say that as part of that commitment, the active employees also agreed to pay higher contributions amount out of their paychecks. I think a lot of people outside this room are going to be watching the state of Vermont to see if we remain committed to our commitments long-term. And I think the rating agencies would also want to make sure that we're adequately funded.
That's all well and nice, but if some of your kids aren't being fed because you're meeting an obligation that's important, but not one you're not going to renege on, isn't that a conversation to have?
It goes back to the trade-off between short-term and long-term.
And the promises we made.
Well,
And our contractually obligated obligations.
which we haven't violated,
Well,
have we?
there was at one point, the former treasurer talked about freezing the retirement funds. I mean, we had meetings in our district with teachers who were livid about this situation.
Oh, sure, I
Around
remember.
21 and 22, 20.
Yeah.
I mean, it was during Zoom time, so. But yeah, we have legally obligated, kind of obligations to these pension funds. You can't just walk away
And I'm not suggesting,
without consequences that are dire to the state's economy and to the state's ability to function.
some of the
So it's
other
not a small
choices could be
thing.
dire. Oh, absolutely not. I don't mean to minimize it, nor am I suggesting walking away from it. I'm just saying, are there ways to make modifications that help other people who are in a dire situation without reneging on the legal obligation? But I appreciate it, short-term, long-term. Thank you.
Yeah, and I would just, I mean, it's a great point, Representative, and I appreciate you bringing it up. I would also just sort of say that if you were to make a move in the short term to free up money now, it will cause larger budgetary pressures in future years.
Right.
So it's sort of like, do you pay for something with cash now, or do you put it on the credit card and pay it with interest in the future? The cost doesn't go away, it gets bigger over time and it gets deferred.
Just a comment. I was on the House Government Operations when we dug into this. And lots of people worked hard to get this train back on the tracks. And Chris was one of those people. We brought him.
It was fun.
Specifically, and Rep. John Gann was the other one.
Yeah,
I mean, he
it's amazing.
used his 20 years of experience at the Securities and Exchange Commission to really inform us as to what was going on. But Chris was even younger then. But
I felt younger then.
just as, right, it aged us a
His
lot.
hair's not gray yet,
Just
though.
as experienced and knowledgeable. And
Yeah.
I just want to recognize his
Thank
work.
you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And Peter Fagan did a lot of work.
Peter did
Yeah,
that.
he did a lot too.
Yeah,
It was a real, good, strong effort by a lot of people.
it was Senator Jeanette White was involved, Representative Sarah Copeland-Hansis, Senator Kitchell, I think Senator Parent. I think everybody who was involved on that task force was inspired to do something else with the rest of their life after it was over.
A nice way to put that.
Indeed.
Fix that problem. There we go.
All right.
When we heard what was happening in states like Illinois, it was like, whoa,
Yeah.
let's not go there.
No, yes, it was a tough thing to do, but we did the right thing at the end. So explain what OPEB means.
Yeah, so we just talked about pensions. The other big ticket retirement obligation is OPEB, other post-employment benefits, which is a really fancy way of saying subsidized healthcare benefits for retirees, retiree healthcare. Before we really dig into this, just a little bit of a history lesson that, and Representative Dickinson mentioned this in the other slides, that before relatively recently, we were funding OPEB on a pay-as-you-go basis with really no pre-funding. And actually before that, the teacher OPEB was being paid out of the corpus of the pension fund, which has the same actuarial effect as shorting the ADAC. You know, you're taking money out that you're not accounting for on the funding end of it. In the past, we had only been budgeting and paying the cost of like actual premiums for today's retirees. There was no setting aside money over the course of somebody's career and investing that money. So there's money there when they retire to pay their benefits. And as a result, we were losing a tremendous opportunity to actually take advantage of investment gains to pay for these future costs, these known future costs. So part of the grand bargain in Act 114 was that the state established a pre-funding policy for OPEB that is actually very similar to the one in place for pensions, where there's an ADEC that's calculated to fund a normal cost and an amortization payment. But instead of being done by 2038, OPEB is on schedule to be done by 2048 because it didn't get started until a couple years ago. Active employees do not contribute to OPEB, but once you're retired and you're enrolled in benefits, you pay a share of the premium. And the amount you pay is based on your years of service. So the longer you serve, the more generous of a subsidy you get on the premium. So you don't make a contribution out of your paycheck while you're working. You pay for it when you're participating in retirement. Very similar to pensions, when all else is equal, you would expect these costs to roughly increase with payroll at about 3% a year. Spoiler alert, we are not seeing that happen this year. And for your budgeting purposes, just like with pensions, the OPEB for the state employees funded out of the underlying personnel budgets. For the teachers, it's primarily funded out of a direct appropriation in the big bill with the normal costs coming out of the ed fund, unfunded liability coming out of the general fund. And a small portion of these costs actually get picked up from the LEAs through what's called the new teacher assessment on teachers hired after 2015. And some of that money that offsets what would otherwise fall to the ed fund and the general fund. So just like with pensions, the OPEB systems continued to improve last year. The assets are steadily growing, but we've got a long way to go on OPEB. We're at the very beginning of pre-funding. The good news is that the investment performance, just like with pensions, exceeded the 7%. The not as good news is that healthcare cost trends, I don't know if you've heard this before, but apparently healthcare is kind of expensive. And OPEB is not immune to that. And the long-term healthcare cost trend rates that the actuaries use in calculating these funding requirements and everything were revised upward this year. So as a result of that, you see some pretty substantial increases year over year in the funding requirements.
31 million.
Yeah, and I want to put a pin in this and maybe divert the spotlight to my colleague in the corner.
Yes.
But the teacher OPEB system, I mean, that's a substantial increase. The increase could have been significantly higher than that had the treasurer's office not renegotiated the healthcare provider. I think they were facing a proposed increase of like 50% and were able to find a provider that had a much, much lower increase year over year. It was still double digits, but it wasn't that. And as a result of those shifts, the ADAC is about 20 million lower than it would have been had they stayed with their prior provider. So I don't know if Tim has anything he would like to add to that very high level description, but as high as that increase is, it could have been significantly worse had the treasurer's office not taken some actions.
Would you like to talk about that at all?
I appreciate the note to Doug and the director of the Retirement Systems in the Treasurer's Office. And it was a very challenging summer. I still remember July 3rd, we received our renewal. We had a 10% cap negotiated in our contract for a rate increase this calendar year. And we received a 50% kill. And at that point, it was late. We didn't really, we usually would plan to go out a bit of a year in advance. Something like that was happening, treasurer can challenge us to find anything. So we ran a bid process and we found a new vendor, HealthSpring, that they were Cigna, now HealthSpring, and they already provide coverage to the retirees from state colleges. So we received a positive reference there, and we were able to bring in what was a 50% increase at 16%. And so, you know, a lot of credit to the team for retirement division. It's a kind of crazy world where we're congratulating ourselves on a 16% increase. But such a slight in this day and age. And our team has done a fabulous job talking to our members. It's a very challenging thing. So I don't want anyone, it's a positive story from a financial perspective, but as I'm sure folks can imagine, it's a very nerve-wracking story as a member when you're changing health insurance providers. And so our vendor has been excellent, our consultant has been excellent, and most importantly, our team has been excellent to make sure that this goes smoothly.
Yeah, I just want to ask you, Tim, is this for both the teachers and the state employees?
No, it's not. So the treasurer's office manages the contract for the teachers, and that's because the employers for teachers are all over the state. For the state employees, DHR manages the contract, and so they procure health insurance for me as an active state employee and for our retirees.
Okay, my understanding is the state employees are self-insured.
Yes.
Vermont state colleges are self-insured. Well, they are. UVM is self-insured, Fletcher Allen is self-insured. The teachers, from what I understand, are not. And so my understanding, you can correct me on this, but my understanding, and it's been, they've had other structures like FISBID and VHI that work with them. But the healthcare thing for the chances are good that if they had a self-insured statewide policy, this is a whole other issue. Comparably, everybody was under the same policy, that it would be easier to go and self-insure and save money. And when you talk about Cigna coming in, that's often the administrator of the self-insured people. It's not self-insured groups. So how does that work? Am I correct in this, or?
So we previously, I'm not sure I follow all of it, but maybe I can talk about some color. Prior to 2021, we were insured through VHI as a self-insured traditional Medicare coverage. When we moved to Vermont Blue Advantage, that moved to a fully insured Medicare Advantage product, and we've been in that space ever since on the teacher side. And one of the things we did this summer was look and say, well, what if we went back to that self-insured traditional Medicare model? And I'll be doing a retirement 101 go out and something together like that. The costs were not tenable. And so, right, and so I don't know if your question is more about combining all of the public employees into one large.
No, it's just that the teachers have been more fragmented because of their contracts around the state in different districts. And the whole point of it is that if they had a statewide contract for health, I mean, that was an issue a couple of years ago. Because they had to get out of the Cadillac plan. You know, I'm just trying to figure out, where are we now? And how does that impact on this 50% increase? And how can we reduce it?
Yeah, you make a really good point that, you know, the teachers are on sort of the exchange plans in their active careers. And then for our pre-Medicare population, they go to a traditional group health insurance plan. So not the exchange type, but it's like your traditional health insurance plan. And then when they age into Medicare eligibility, they go to a Medicare Advantage plan. That is challenging and confusing, and it moves through. So I take your point that some amount of cohesion from career to retirement may produce some value. It's challenging given the many employer structure. Perhaps there's value, but I've not studied that. I wouldn't be able to speak intelligently on that.
So I'm looking at the time and this is so interesting that we're already way past time and Emily's here also. So if we can wrap this up in 5 minutes and take a 5-minute break, then we can have Emily and get to the book. Okay?
Sounds great.
All right.
All right, well, this picture is not quite as exciting as the one on the other slide deck, but this shows you the funded ratios for OPEB. My takeaway here is, you know, we're so early in this process that, you know, we're showing some encouraging results, you know, 16% funded already in the state system, 13% in the teacher system, but we've only been pre-funding for a couple of years. So we got a long way to go. And just like with the pension systems, a lot of the progress on paying down the principal is going to happen in the final, you know, 10 to 15 years. So you've seen a variation of this with the pensions. This just shows you where we are right now with the VSERS OPEB with, you know, assets, liabilities, and the unfunded net OPEB liability. That's like the unfunded liability. Again, the pre-funding is so minimal at this point because we're so early in this process that, you know, the unfunded liabilities are substantial. They're actually bigger on the OPEB side than they are on the pension side for the state employees. Buckle up, 2048 is a long way away compared to 2038. So we're going to keep our eye on
You'll
it.
still be here, Chris. I bet the rest.
Only if you lower retirement eligibility, which would represent an actuarial loss, I think.
Yeah, okay.
Same deal for the teachers here. You'll see that, you know, on the teacher front, the unfunded OPEB liability is much lower for OPEB than for the pensions, but it's still over $1 billion of unfunded liability.
0.7 billion for both combined for the team.
Yeah, we got a ways to go, and OPEB's big. That's a big hit on the state's balance sheet. So here's another version of what the sort of the gains and losses over the last year. You know, I just wanted to point out something that was kind of interesting that, you know, even though you've only been pre-funding for a few years, pre-funding generated over $37 million of income from investments for the two OPEB systems last year. So, you know, it's showing meaningful results fiscally. That's only going to get bigger as there's a larger balance of assets invested in the systems, but it's already showing a pretty notable impact and benefit just for pre-funding and investing the money and not just doing it on a pay-go basis.
Great. Thank you.
Again, here's a chart with the investment performance. I'm not going to go deep into it, but you could see that we're so early in this system that investment gains and losses and experience aren't a hugely meaningful factor when you're dealing with billions of dollars, but they're rapidly becoming meaningful. So here's your OPEB ADEC for VSERS. It's a similar chart here that you'll notice that before 2023, we were not funding the ADEC. We were funding the pay-go cost, the amount that you needed to pay. It's a lower amount because you don't need to build up a head of assets to invest. But when pre-funding started, We started funding at that actuarially determined level in 2023 and moving forward. But you'll also see that that cost as a percentage of active payroll is increasing at a rate steeper than what you're seeing on the pension side. That's because of those healthcare cost trends we were talking about. Same deal on the teacher system here. And that's it.
Great, Chris. You make things interesting.
I try.
Appreciate that after lunch.
It makes me look forward to my future retirement.
There you go. Motivated. All right.